very little distortion, despite the clump now being slightly ahead of the doors. It is not until the center warp is taken in by several feet further that the net begins to distort in the outer wings. This shows us that it is preferable to have the center warp hauled slightly too much rather than not enough. As we shorten the center warp, there can be a tendency for other problems to arise that may deter many skippers from shortening up the center warp by as much as they should do. The first potential problem is that the center clump weight could lift off the seabed if it's not heavy enough. The clump weight could also lift off the seabed when an inappropriate warp-to-depth ratio is used. The second potential problem is that the trawl doors become unstable due to the changes in the outside warp angle and warp tension. This could be due to the doors not being correctly matched to the twin rignets and vessel. A third potential problem is related to fish behavior. The increase in door spread could create too great a bridle angle or too great a wing end spread for the target species of fish concerned. A correctly rigged 3-warp twin rig will provide consistent performance at sea and will minimize the risk of damage to the nets. Alterations to the length of the center warp are quick and easy to achieve, without the need for hauling the gear. In comparison, the 2-warp twin rig requires a different approach. In this setup, the nets, bridles, sweeps, doors and clump weight are rigged in a similar manner to that of a 3-warp system. From the nets to the trawl warps, everything is of equal length as before. The difference is that each of the main trawl warps divides into 2 split warps. The outside split warps are attached to their respective port and starboard doors. The 2 inside split warps are both attached to the center clump weight. These split warps can vary in length from 15 fathoms up to 125 fathoms. The length is dictated by the length of sweep and bridle used and also the door spread that is needed. If we look at a 2-warp rig with all 4 split warps of equal length, we can see that the nets are distorted. The 2 inside wings are slack and need to be pulled forwards to square up the gear. In the 3-warp rig, we did this by hauling in the center warp. For the 2-warp rig, it is more usual to square the gear by adding extensions to the 2 outside split warps. How do we know what length of extension to use? In the 2-warp rig, it is impossible to use the warp divergence method to calculate the door spread. This is because the port and starboard warps don't go directly to the trawl doors, but deviate where the split warps join onto them. Even using acoustic door sensors, it is still difficult to square up the gear in the 2-warp system. However, it is possible to calculate the spread at the end of the main warps. From this, we can work out a suitable length for the extensions that are needed in the outside split warps to get the gear square. This is a simplified calculation and will only generate an approximate result. As for the 3-warp system, a set of tables has been developed to enable skippers to estimate the extension needed to square up the gear. We need to have separate tables for each split warp length, because the geometry of the 2-warp system alters considerably when changes are made to the split warp lengths. In this example, in the flume tank, we have the equivalent of 75 fathoms of split warps. We have a main warp length of 100 fathoms. If we measure the warp spread, that is, the distance between the main warps of the splits, we obtain a figure of about 90 feet. At sea, we can do this by using the warp divergence method. We now look in the table of extensions for 75 fathom split warps. For 90 feet of warp spread and for 100 fathoms of warp out, we can see that the estimated extension length needed is 8.3 feet. When this 8.3 feet is added to the outside split warps, it will allow the trawl doors to drop back, thereby reducing the tension in the outside split warps and increasing the tension in the inside split warps. This allows the doors to spread more and may alter the geometry of the warps. For this reason, it is advisable to measure the warp spread again and check it against the tables in case a change in extension length is needed. Having added the extension and being satisfied that the gear is symmetrical, we can now look at the second part of the 2 warp tables to give us an indication of the door spread. This table can be used once the extension has been added to the outside split warps and the nets are square. Using our warp spread of 90 feet and our warp length of 100 fathoms, we get an estimated door spread of 285 feet. This figure is accurate enough to calculate the bridle angles and wing end spreads, if needed, to give a fuller picture of the gear parameters. There are many combinations of warp length, split warp length, and bridle lengths. Because of this, these setup tables often need tailoring to a particular vessel's requirements. In our flume tank test, we did several experiments using the same overall warp lengths, but used 3 different lengths of split warps. This was to simulate a vessel towing the same nets, sweeps and doors at a constant warp-to-depth ratio with different split warp lengths. In this situation, if we increase the split warps to 100 fathoms, the door spread increased to 312 feet, with an extension of 11.5 feet. If the split warp length is reduced to 50 fathoms, this restricts the door spread to 250 feet, using an extension of 6 feet. Once a skipper has tuned his 2 warp setup, there is very rarely any need to alter the extension lengths, unless another part of the gear is changed. The extension needed in the outside split warp of a 2-warp rig will normally be much less than the shortening of the center warp in a 3-warp rig for a vessel towing similar gear. One of the main limitations of the 2-warp rig is a reduced door spread compared with that of the equivalent 3-warp system. This is due to spread of the doors being restricted by the relatively short split warps. As we have seen, the 3-warp rig can be tuned while towing the gear, whereas the 2-warp system needs to be hauled before alterations can be made. One of the main advantages of the 2-warp rig is that it enables a trawler to tow a twin rig system using an existing 2-barrel trawl winch. This can reduce the initial outlay required for changing to the twin rig by saving the expense of a new 3-barrel trawl winch and rerouting of deck leads. However, a 2-warp system lacks the versatility of the 3-warp system, where the door spread can be tuned to suit different fish species by altering the center warp. In both the 2 and the 3-warp methods, the alterations obtained from the respective tables should be used in conjunction with any other indications of gear symmetry. Other indications can include meshing of fish and shellfish in areas of slack netting, distortion of the lower bosom meshes of the nets, distance and angle measurements from acoustic gear sensors. In this video, we hope to convey an understanding of squaring up the nets in a twin rig system using basic gear parameters that are available to all fishermen, no matter what the size of their vessel. Remember, the optimum tuning of a twin rig can be further enhanced if used in conjunction with any additional measurements made using acoustic gear sensors and tension meters. As the warp tensions within any twin rig system will vary considerably, the warps tend to stretch at different rates. To reduce errors in measurements and calculations, it is important that the warp lengths are checked regularly. It would appear that twin rig systems in general are much more tolerant to discrepancies than a single net rig. When compared with a single net, a twin rig tends to fish well even when the gear is not trimmed perfectly. This video film has provided an insight into the setup of a twin rig trawl and what can happen to it when rigging changes are made. Having a correctly tuned twin rig setup, either a 2-warp or 3-warp system, means that the gear is fishing at its very best. This means less risk, less time wasted, and better fishing opportunities.